Hello everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our workshop. So I'm just posting, for those of you who haven't seen, our shared note-taking collaborative document that we'll be using throughout the workshop in the chat. So you should be able to access that now. And we've got icebreaker question for everyone joining to please let us know what your favorite prehistoric animal or dinosaur is. And there's a link for some inspiration. Please feel free to also post a picture like Yo has that's inspired. I tried to post one of a woolly mammoth and it took up 3 pages, which I think is pretty fitting. So I took mine out. But yeah, let us know in the document there.
Bonus points also if you can add a link, because I'm sort of like, I know I've heard of a megalodon, but I can't remember what it actually is.
A megalodon. I think that's like it's in water for sure. I know that I don't know the quality. Yeah, giant shark. I'm not sure the quality of movie that's just come out about the megalodon. I have seen trailers, I can take a guess. But that's as far as my knowledge is on that.
Sounds like the prehistoric version of Sharknado, like high
I think
quality.
so. That's great. We'll just keep filling in these as we wait for people to join. Velociraptor, that's a classic. Love it. Whatever the chicken evolved from. Just post this in the chat again for anyone who's just joined who may have missed it.
I'm a little in awe. I'd never heard of the Meganeura before, but that's like a dragonfly that's like this big. And I mean, it's bad enough if you're walking and a dragonfly flies in your face. I'm not sure I would want to be too near a Meganeura, but it sounds cool.
Yeah, these are all great. I'd comment on some, but I will show off my lack of prehistoric animal knowledge by not pronouncing them correctly.
There's no judgment. It's a totally safe space. Does anyone want to share something about their animal that they've chosen?
Chose a woolly mammoth because one of the starring roles in the movie franchise Ice Age, which is a childhood favorite of mine, and Manny was my favorite character, but that's the extent of why I chose that animal. All right. It seems like everybody has filtered in. What do you think, Yo? Should we give people one more minute or yeah, one more? Okay.
I think we can make a start. I think we've
We can
probably
make a start.
settled.
Perfect. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our workshop. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Talia Kaplan. I am a project officer on the Data for Science and Health team at the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust, for those of you who don't know, is a research funder who funds all things kind of health research. And myself and Yo work on the Data for Science and Health team, which tries to bring cool things that are happening in data science to health research. So I'll be helping to facilitate this workshop, but I'll hand you over to Yo, who is our expert in residence, all things open source, to give you a little bit more flavor on the types of things that we'll be talking about today.
Cool, thank you, Talia. So like Talia, folks, I work at the Data for Science and Health team at the Wellcome Trust. My name is Yo Yehudi. Before I worked at the Wellcome Trust, I worked in research software engineering at the University of Cambridge for about 5 years. And if you have met me, I know a couple of you here have, you will know that I am absolutely embarrassingly devoted to open source software and to robust research code. And so one of the things that actually we're doing at the moment in Wellcome is we've launched a site called osscience.org. It is really empty. You're welcome to visit it right now. But the idea behind this is that we would like to curate some of the stuff that is good around good quality open research software. And as part of that, it sort of raises the question, well, actually, what is good and good enough? And so that's sort of what sparked off the ideas to run these workshops. And in particular, I think it's also important to think about the fact that good is not the same as perfect. And so one thing that I worry about a lot when I see people working on code is when we talk about good practice to the degree where actually it makes it almost impossible to get in because you think, well, I've got to do this and I've got to do this and I've got to do this. And actually, even half of that would have been incredible. So we thought maybe we'd build this workshop around 3 specific questions. So first of all, there's getting started. So if you want to share your code, what do you do to share it effectively? And what is good practice? But then how do you make sure, like, what's good enough? Because that won't be the same as perfect, but it will still be useful. And what is like the bare minimum that means it is useful? Um, and then also talking about the culture. So if you have worked on an open source project before, then you probably have some familiarity with some of the norms that there may be in different projects. But when you're getting started, sometimes it's just like I don't even know where to start. Like for me, my personal journey around open source software and research software, I thought it was a great idea and I thought it was really naive. I was like, how could you possibly manage to run this? How do you get started? I literally the only way that I got started working on open research software was because I got a job being paid to do so. I couldn't have figured out how to do it, for example, in any sort of volunteer capacity. I was a bit stuck. So figuring out ways to make good culture that brings on and retains people is probably the third topic that we will discuss. So the basic structure of today is that we're going to look at those 3 questions, talk about them. I think we'd planned maybe breakout rooms, but I think given the size, I would suggest that we don't actually need a breakout room. We can probably just discuss them in one single group for today. And I think that's everything I have at the moment. Are there any questions right now or thoughts or comments on what we've said so far? Feel free to either type it in the chat or unmute if you prefer.
Well, if anyone kind of thinks on a question they might have, I just wanted to plug the fact that we'll be taking notes kind of throughout this collaborative session, and we are going to work towards putting the notes together to create an article on kind of defining the good in open source science and research. That's going to be posted on ossscience.org, our blog. And if you'd be interested after this session in helping us kind of pull that together or contributing at all to ossscience.org in the future, then please just reach out, send us an email at o.science@wellcome.org. It can also be found at the bottom of the collaborative document. We'd be really interested to work with any of you on that and on anything in the future as well. Yeah, perfect. You just put it in the chat. That's amazing. Okay, well, I think that if we are not going to do the breakout groups, then it would be great to have an introduction to some of the folks that we have here today. I don't know if we wanted to, I don't want to pick on anybody to introduce themselves, but if anyone felt like maybe introducing yourself, saying maybe a bit about why you chose your prehistoric animal or dinosaur, if you did so, that would be great.
I can go. Hello, my name is Sarah Gibson, and I am an open source infrastructure engineer at a startup called 2i2c. So as you can imagine, I'm a tiny bit biased to the open source world. I'm also a fellow of the SSI software sustainability as well. So yeah, I'm just like really excited and excited to talk about how we can make those on ramps for people coming into open source and sharing their code a lot more easier.
That's great. Glad to have you along to the session.
I'll go ahead and apologize because I'm going to have to leave early. Nice to meet Sarah, because I was talking about you the other day with a colleague who's involved with 2i2c up here, and I guess the Canadian representative on your team. So I'm Mark Leggett. I'm longtime open source advocate, and I actually work now. I'm the Director of International Relations for an organization in Canada called the New DRI Organization, because it doesn't have a name yet. So we're a funder and a provider of services for high performance computing, research software, and research data management. So again, I apologize for joining in, having to leave early, but interested just to engage in open source conversation.
No worries at all, Mark. Nice to have you on here, fellow Canadian. Does anyone else want to take a moment to introduce themselves?
Okay, fine. Since everyone's being shy, I'm Electra. I'm a senior research software engineer in UCL. Yeah, I just wanted to hear and learn mostly in this session. I have endless discussions about open source with David from UCL, which you probably know. I'm the skeptic. So yeah, I want to hear and learn.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Annika. I'm also a senior research software developer at UCL. Similar to Electra, I mainly came along to learn about open science, open software, because I've been working in the corporate and public sector for a longer period in between. So for the past 6 years, I haven't been engaging with open software really.
Nice to meet you. Glad to have you here as well. I know Beth said that, yes, microphone. Perfect. That's exactly what I was about to ask of you, Beth. So thank you very much. Wonderful. So now that we've all been introduced, I think we can probably kick off the first topic of conversation. I know that Sarah, you put a question there in the chat. I think it was Sarah. Yeah, Sarah, about the first topic. I don't know, Yo, if you wanted to elaborate any more on that question.
Scrolling up, so for getting started, are we focusing just on those who want to open their own code or widening the scope to getting started contributing upstream? My suggestion, let's start with getting started, and if there's time, do the second bit as well. Back to you, Talia, if you want to kick things off.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the first thing to note is does anyone want to appoint themselves as note taker for this section of the conversation? Does anyone feel comfortable kind of jotting down the conversation? Perfect. Thank you so much. Beth, I don't think that we need a reporter because we are all here, so we won't have a need for feedback. And if anyone else wants to take the role of the chair for this conversation as well, whose kind of responsibility is just to make sure that everyone has a chance to kind of say their opinion and speak if they would like to. Does anyone feel like chairing this section of the workshop? I'm happy to chair. So I'll do it for this section, then maybe somebody else can do it for the next. All right, perfect. So getting started, yeah. In your groups in this whole session, discuss what people need to do to get started in open source research and software. So this is anything from key resources, first steps, does my institution have any requirements? These are kind of some prompts that me and Yo thought might be helpful in guiding the conversation, but are not rules or strict areas that we need to stick to. So I guess I'd ask if anyone has any kind of like first responses or instincts to any of these prompts that they'd like to share with the group.
One other suggestion, two things. One is if you're more comfortable like adding a bunch of bullet points in the notes or just pasting stuff into chat, go ahead. Or if the other side of this is mostly help, I have more questions than I have answers, ask those questions, because then some of us can also maybe do the answers.
As you can imagine, I have many opinions. So it's Talia, I want to see your best chairing to stop me speaking too much. But like my first like response to especially does my institution have any requirements around this? Like my advice to a new starter would definitely be looking into that, since I think software licensing can already be like a mountain to get into straight off the bat. And so checking like what your institution's guidelines are on that as a like a first stop, like starting point to make sure you're following policy and legally are covered before you start like putting your code out there would be a very wise place to start.
Do you maybe, Sarah, have any examples of possible scenarios that institutions might present to a coder who's not familiar with what a license might look like?
If I'm being like completely honest, I think actually a traditional academic institution won't know what a software license looks like either. And you're probably opening a can of worms with them as well. But it would probably fall under their intellectual property policies and such that any work that you produce while you're researching at an institution would be owned by the university, and that does include code in the same way as it includes paper outputs, and they could try and put the same kind of restrictions on your code as they do your papers, such that you can go public once it's like published in a journal or something like that. Like a lot of people don't put their papers on preprints until it's at least been accepted for publication at a journal, and they might try and do the same thing with a code repository as well. But I will admit that most of my experience with software dev and like open source is like comes after my experience in academia. So I'm like playing a little bit of the conjecture game here. So if there is anybody with more experience on that, please do correct me, but that would be my instinct.
Mark, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, it's a nice small group, so probably don't have to do that. But I would, it's interesting in the Canadian context, software code at universities is usually owned by the faculty member. So usually the collective agreements in Canadian universities reserve the intellectual property in course material, like lecture notes and those kinds of things, and research as resting with the faculty member. Unfortunately, for non-faculty members, including students, it often is much murkier. So I would certainly agree with Sarah's comment that checking your institution's legal or union or whatever your context is, contracts and how that ownership plays out for different types of positions would probably be useful. Sounds like in the UK, the institution owns the code, or is that right?
I think that's generally the case, that anything that you do, like any intellectual property you produce whilst at the university, belongs to the university. So I've even, in cases, advised people just write your grant, where in your grant it says in the line, it will be open source. And that way your university can't argue, because otherwise you don't get the funding.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I think in my experience, I will agree that there's a lot of confusion around how the licensing works. I personally find it very hard to care about it, forgive me. But yeah, as RSCs, we get tons of questions like, what license should I use? And it's really not a streamlined process at the university level, even in such a big institute that openly embraces open science. It's not a very streamlined way to define it. So yeah, finding out what your institution wants might not be straightforward, but probably a good starting point. I don't know. I still would be interested in what happens beyond that. You found the license, you put it there, you open it on GitHub, press the button, whatever. And then what?
In my experience, usually no one cares. Like there are a lot of open repositories on GitHub. And like, so when I talk to folks who are getting used to the idea of putting their research and their research code on GitHub in an open public repository, I get a lot of like, what if I'm scooped? What if this? What if that? And I'm like, it's not like someone has like a bat signal that lights out, that like lights up for every new public repository that goes up on GitHub, because it would be on all of the time. So I think while there are absolutely cases of people being scooped in this manner, for sure, I think they're in like the vast minority. So like what comes next almost isn't about software best practices, it's about community management best practices, and like telling people your project is there and setting guidelines for how people can, you know, add to it, improve it, build upon it, you know, documenting what this code is intended to do and like what is in scope of the project, and, you know, thinking about roadmaps so that when people come along and are like, I'm so annoyed that your code doesn't do this really specific thing that I want it to do, you can have discussions about whether that is because no one's just developed that feature yet, or because it's completely out of scope of the project. But like saying like, right, you've put it on GitHub, now you're going to do a whole lot of community management discussions. I think that can be another huge barrier to people opening up their work, which is why I asked the question of, do we want to talk about opening up your opening up your own code or contributing upstream. Because while it can be just as intimidating to sidle up to someone's project and be like, hi, I have an idea, would you like it? At least the responsibility of maintenance and community management isn't on this new person's shoulders. Like, if it's a well-established upstream project, there will be a team doing that. And I wonder if that's just like, I don't know if it's like a direct swap of like one intimidating thing for an exactly as intimidating thing, or if that feels a little bit like more like I can dip my toes in and go back if I need to.
Why do you think scooping is such a minor possibility? I mean, when a researcher has concerns about it, scooping does happen. You cannot just tell them, oh no, it doesn't happen that often, it's okay, open it. I've heard concerns about, okay, if it's someone scoops your research and publishes it in an English-speaking journal, whatever, can be caught. And they don't cite you according to your license. But say someone publishes in a different country or starts a company with your idea in a different country, how do you track this down? Because I've heard these concerns. So you cannot just dismiss it and say scooping happens very rarely. It does happen. What are you against it?
Well, I think it's because we're talking about research software here rather than just like any software. And I think research software is often very specific, very, very, very tightly scoped. And it's often messy as well. Like, be a whole ton of work to like overhaul that and get it into like a product fashion, which is why the role of RSEs became a thing, right? To make research software more sustainable. So yeah, I just think the amount of, unicorns out there in the research software world that would actually spin out into being a really massively profitable company, I think the probability of that is just low, not zero. You're right, it's not, but yeah, I just don't see it. I just can't imagine a world where it happens that often. And I do think it's like a huge concern that people put forward, because what they're really concerned about is people coming along and criticizing their work than, actually wanting to steal it. I think people are just a bit like, oh, what if people say it's bad?
I had one comment I think I would like to extend Sarah's thoughts, which is that the sooner you get your code out, the sooner you show that it's yours. And oh, I don't know if you can hear the like fighter jet that's going past. It's really loud. And there's two scenarios. One is that someone's scooped and they steal the glory that goes to you, in which case people will see that they've stolen your code and not credited you and they've committed research misconduct. Or there's a scenario where it's such a separate use case, maybe in a different country, that actually they're not taking away from you anyway. But ultimately, if it's research misconduct to steal your work and you have it on the public record early, then it's probably better than not having it on the public record early.
Yeah, I would agree with Yo. That's a really important point. Early and well described with, appropriate GitHub links or DOI or whatever seems appropriate, so it's citable. I think a lot of times people use code when a license or the use isn't clear. They simply find it in a GitHub repo and there's no clear reference to a specific type of license or use. So I suspect a lot of use of code happens simply because people feel that in that ambiguity that the creator is offering it for people to make use of in whatever way they see fit. So in addition to making it early release, I think it is important to attach some kind of, whether it's an official license, like a viral license or a Berkeley or some other kind of open source license, or it's simply a clear statement in a README or appropriate spot in the document that indicates the creator's interests and desire for reuse.
Can I just quickly ask, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the terminology like viral licenses. If you could just unpack that really quickly.
Well, maybe I'll use a specific use case. In my 10 or 12 years ago, I created an open source project called Islandora because I live on Prince Edward Island, and it was a nice, unique name, easy to Google. And I worked with the university, to come back to the previous comment, to create a spin-off company. And in all the talk about intellectual property and protection and things, an individual asked me whether I wanted to make money off the project or change the world, which sounds like a silly question, but it's the fundamental question I think many open source creators need to ask themselves. Do you want to make money, or do you want to create a strong community of like-minded folks? So I decided on the second one. So I chose, we were using Drupal, which itself uses what's called a viral license. So if you use a piece of software that is licensed with a viral type license, it means that anybody that uses that code and changes it has to contribute their changes back to the community. And Drupal is a good example of a software framework that uses that kind of license. The other kind of license is a more restrictive one that basically says, for example, you can't use it for commercial uses or other kinds of restrictions. And so we felt that the best way for the open source software that we developed to have an impact was to attach a viral license to it, to ensure that that all uses that at least were known would have to release their code to the larger community. So it just continues to build the community. So in our case, we use the GNU type license, which has various flavors. And the biggest disadvantage of licenses in open source is that there are hundreds of them, and it's unfortunately very complicated, which is why sometimes it's easier just to pick a simple one. So that's an example where the desire of the creators was to allow anybody to use it, whether it was a company or an individual in another country, as long as they agreed to the license, and they would have to contribute their code back. There is a really good open source license selection tool. I'll see if I can find it. Or do you know of it already?
I've literally just Googled it.
Okay. There is a specific one. So if you find one, Sarah, put it in. I'll see if I can find the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, chooselicense.com.
Okay, great. Oh, there it is. Got it.
I think we have a couple minutes left before we're going to change topic. Apart from licenses, is there anything anyone specifically would like to highlight as important for getting started? Or maybe ask, like, I don't know what else I would do. Any suggestions?
I think my question would go in the direction of community pleasing. So what I find hard is to, if I'm not the researcher, but I'm developing the software for them, how do I actually make sure that I'm finding people that are interested in that and that can perhaps provide some early feedback? Or yeah, I mean, you can talk to the researcher and get them to name a few other organizations, but I'm not sure that you always get to the right point that will enable you to actually have people wanting to contribute and wanting to use your software.
Another reason why I was asking whether this was going to be about upstream or not, because like one solution is if it's like, you know, we're developing a new algorithm for some kind of data science project, is there somewhere, for example, if it's Python based, is there somewhere in NumPy or SciPy or scikit-learn where that algorithm could live? I think in a more, I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by early feedback as well, because I can see that going in one direction, that's sort of like peer code review. And I think you can, I know that there's definitely initiatives coming out of Oxford of like just getting another set of eyes on your code, which can be particularly difficult if you're working with a researcher because they don't have the coding expertise and you're kind of like in your little silo of you know, of what code should be written or not. But I don't know if you had another idea of what feedback you were looking for.
I was more thinking around end users that are beyond the research group, that perhaps have slightly different ideas of how features should work to make it more generally applicable, rather than being a very niche for one specific thing that the researcher wants to do.
Yeah, that's hard. And I think judging the right point in the project to be asking those questions is super hard, especially if you're like in the really early phases prototyping things. And I think the advice I would give would be, in this case, software best practices and making sure you're writing stuff such that if you do have to add a new feature, you know, it's all modularized and like it's not going to be an unpicking everything kind of task. And it kind of like delays that community building question to the point where you might be like, oh right, this might actually be something, which I think is really difficult to know in the early stages. That was like a very non-answer, I'm sorry.
Well, that's great. I think that we covered some good, definitely broad topics specifically around licensing and stuff in that conversation. I think that I will move us on to the next topic that we wanted to cover, unless anyone has any kind of burning last comments that they'd like to make. For this next section, we are going to be talking about what open enough looks like. So myself and Yo wanted to kind of delve into how we can make sure that the perfect doesn't really get in the way of the good. So what is, you know, the bare minimum that's useful? When is open potentially the wrong choice? Are there nice to haves that aren't, you know, shouldn't be included in a MVP or bare minimum? Yeah, if something can't be open, how can it still be useful? Kind of questions around this. So I guess to give potentially Beth a little break, does anyone else want to volunteer as the note taker for this section?
I can take notes. Smart.
Thanks for that, Mark. And I will nominate Yo as the chair of this next one. You've been doing a great job. Do you want to open up the conversation, Yo?
Thank you so much, Talia. I think Talia also failed to mention in the previous group that she's done some user research as well. So I'm secretly wondering if she had any insights on gathering more info from potential users, but maybe we can loop back to that later so I don't put her too much on the spot. So now we have moved on to the open enough. I'm going to start just by posing a question. Has anyone ever tried to contribute to an open project or thought that is too much work? Why should I have to do that? Maybe the answer is no.
I haven't myself, but I've heard that complaint from almost everyone that attempted.
Oh dear. And Beth is contributing in the chat. So I've looked into it, but it's been hard to know where to start or what is good enough to make as a contribution, which I think is a perfect point. That's just like, yeah, where do I start? And I know certainly some projects have a much bigger onboarding curve than others will. So I was talking with a colleague who was making contributions to Kubernetes. I've just seen Sarah's face. Sarah, do you have experiences here you want to share?
Not upstream to Kubernetes, but just like props to that person, because I use Kubernetes in my daily work and that is a monster of a project. So props to your colleague.
So they shared with me some of the issues, like they'd made a pull request to Kubernetes, so they tried to make a contribution. And they had to use these codes like / this and / that and all these codes in the GitHub issue that set off the bots in just the right way to then get the review. And so the basic default is the first pull request that you make, even if it's just like, I don't know, fixing a typo, you're going to do it wrong because you won't have known about all of the codes that you have to be adding in. So I guess those sorts of feelings were the reasons we thought that this might be a nice place to start. Like, what is enough? Should this be a reasonable requirement? I feel bad. I don't want to actually point my finger like Kubernetes, you are bad. It's not what I'm saying, not even slightly. But I guess that if you're trying to onboard people to help out, or you just want this to be useful research software, are there places where you might say, well, this is my ideal, I don't know, having it running in Docker in a beautiful virtual machine with CI, or maybe actually you just want approachable. And I want, yeah, maybe someone has a scenario where you've done approachable or where you've done good enough, but you also have a dream scenario.
I haven't contributed myself, but I have taken part in a session where actually somebody was trying to engineer approachable, and that was at PyData a few years ago, where they were trying to get people to contribute to Python. And they had a whole workshop afternoon where they were basically showing people how to download the code, how to make their changes, how to submit pull requests and things like that. So, I mean, you get a different, or you get a selected community already because it's people attending PyData, it's not one of the cheapest conferences, and it's not like community-wide reaching out, but at least it felt like a good starting point.
Would you define that as sort of like mentoring people as a form of onboarding?
Mentoring, perhaps even going a step further, because there it was really teaching, really like this is the step, this is how you do it, and this is how you get a result out of it. It's not so much like, would you like to try this or would you like to try that? There weren't a lot of options given. It was more like teaching, really. Maybe the politer word is guiding. But yeah, it didn't exactly feel like mentoring, but I think mentoring could be a good option as well. Yeah.
Super. If I turn that actually, Beth, do you feel like if you had a project you were interested in, and you had the option to attend like an onboarding teaching session, do you feel like that would help you get past the barriers that you felt? Sorry, I know it takes a longer to type up than it does to unmute and respond. Right, yeah, that's a good point. So it helps with the barriers, but it also feels like it's a big time investment for a single project. Yeah, that's fair. I'm gonna, oh, go for it, Sarah.
Sorry, I was just gonna sort of like counteract that a little bit and be like, the project that takes the time to sit with you and tell you, This is how you open an issue. This is how you open a pull request. This is how we do everything. You are probably much more likely to continue contributing to. Even though it is a big time investment, but that initial good experience, the amount of people I speak to who would, so I didn't mention at the start, but I'm actually in Project Jupiter as well, and I'm part of the Jupiter Hub core team as well as the Binder team, helping operate mybinder.org. And a lot of the folks I now work with as like core contributor team members in Jupiter Hub talk about their first time contributing to the project, and someone came along and was like, hello, thank you, this is great, this is how we do everything else around here, was the driving factor for them remaining in the project. So in terms of the community and the sustainability and the usership of that project, I think there's massive value in that. And I think it's very beneficial for the contributor as well, because there's a lot of skills in there that actually aren't going to be like that tech stack specific. It's going to be like, how do you ask a good question, like in a way that you can get help quickly, and you can get to the information you need quickly, and like how do you give constructive reviews on pull requests and everything. All of these are transferable between like any open source project. So like, I guess that's how I would sort of like, yeah, it's a big time investment for one project, but I bet that will end up being your heart and soul project as well.
Yeah, I would hugely support Sarah's comments. I know in the early days of our Islandora project, we did training type sessions around the world. And it was partly because I had a grant in the early days of the project that allowed me to travel. So we went all over the place, and training always included training from kind of the manager level of the team down to the developer. And we would often have kind of concurrent threads, and that was entirely designed to build community. So ranging again from how do you promote, facilitate, and otherwise support an open source project at your institution as the project manager or lead, and how do you install the software, and how do you become a committer, all of those kinds of things. And that was critical to a project that now has 500-600 institutions using it all over the world. So big investment, as Sarah said, but depending on your interest, may well be an important step in the development of your project, I would say.
Are we talking about barriers that cannot be solved by decent documentation? Like how to contribute? It might sound silly, but all the difficult projects to contribute to don't have any documentation, or they do have some, and then people don't maintain it, and then it diverges what you read in the documentation to what the expectations of the community are, to require instead so intense training. I don't know.
I think, okay, most open source projects are going to be volunteer run. Very few have many company backings, which means you're already dealing with people who are doing this in their spare time. And yeah, I think it's like super easy to let things like project roadmaps get out of date very quickly. And like the project roadmap will be the answer to the question of, I'm in a new project, where can I start helping? Because like that's the document that tells you what features they're planning on developing next, right? And I think there's like some technical challenges in that roadmaps get updated really frequently versus like, you know, unexpected complexity in like those features they want to implement versus a static representation of that roadmap that is available on like some website as like a landing page for a new person. And I think it's just like super easy, especially when you're volunteering, to let those things slide and things end up becoming like community knowledge rather than actually written down. And that is the thing that makes people feel unwelcome in projects, when people intrinsically know things and they are also like not as open to passing on that knowledge. You know, there's sometimes people are like, oh no, that's out of date, I'm really sorry, we do it this way. But then there are some people who are like, you don't know that, why don't you know that? And that distinction makes a huge difference. So yes, I think a lot of this is documentation gets out of date, but it doesn't often come out of malice. I think it's just like really hard keeping all of that stuff up to date.
Is it though a bigger time commitment than having training happening? In my mind, hands-on training is a very heavy-handed solution, and it's a lot of time commitment, preparation, people to do it regularly. Isn't it easier to just keep the documentation up to date?
I don't know, because like in terms of project roadmaps, if you're not like that's another community thing, that's like another meeting that needs hashing out and stuff. We've recently been talking about over into I2C, I think it was X-Array's roadmap, and we were like, whoa, this is amazing. And like they were like, and the guy also happened to be in our Slack channel as well, and they were talking about how it started like pre-COVID times, when they managed to actually, you know, sit at a decent breakfast table somewhere at some conference and, you know, hash out the first draft. But then it was actually quite a long iterative process before that project roadmap got, you know, published. So I think they're both exactly the same amount of work and effort, just like coming from different angles. And I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. I'd say by having all of these pathways, you're making your pool of contributors more diverse, because there'll be some people who respond better to training than other people who are just like, no, I'll just go away and read the documentation, bring myself up to speed, and I'll let you know if I have any questions. So yeah, I'm not sure that you could just trade one out for the other.
I would, oh, sorry, Annika, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to add that for me, actually, there's something to be said about the human factor, because at the point where somebody says, I make a time commitment because I think it's really important that we are contributing to that, I feel more inclined to be equally motivated and contributed because somebody else does. I mean, it sounds a little bit naive and like following the herd, but at the same time, I do feel that because there's a movement, I feel engaged, it gives me motivation and it gives me energy to contribute as well. And that I wouldn't get from reading documentation. In fact, it would put me off if somebody said, there are 100 pages of documentation, and in order to contribute, you have to read them all first.
Yeah, I would agree 100%, Annika. I think for me, good documentation is important and to some degree critical to providing training. But good documentation helps somebody install and use the software, whereas training and community activity builds the community and the movement, as you suggest, and it gets people excited. Reading documentation gets some people excited, but participating, especially in the days when we could do hands-on training, really, really gets people involved. And I think that's where they make a decision to commit of their time in a substantial way and become a committer or improve the documentation, contribute to training. So if you want to build a community, which you don't have to do to have a successful, well, sorry, I think in order to have a successful open source project, you have to have a strong community. You can certainly release open source software that gets used, but I don't think you're going to have a strong community around it unless you have things like training and other kinds of similar events.
Okay, I see Sarah has to drop off. Bummer. Thank you so much for coming along, Sarah. And for being our resident expert. Thank you so much. I wanted to add one more comment actually. So I know if I'm like, if I have made a mistake or if I'm not sure about something, let's say I'm running through docs, I know if I'm in a training, right, and someone else asks a question, really often I'll be like, thank God they've asked this question. I didn't want to ask it. And so that it sort of means that for every person who's had a thought, there's probably another person who's never expressed that thought. And so if someone hits the docs and the answer they need isn't there, then you may just lose them. Whereas if you have the human avenues available to really get people involved in safe spaces to ask these questions, then I think that can help build things, build a bit more continuity and community into things. Mark, I know you said you had to drop off early and you're doing an incredible job of noting right now. Do you need us to free you?
I do actually. I was going to say I'm going to have to go in a couple of minutes to join another call. So yeah, I will let you continue the discussion. It's nice to see. I've been involved in the open source community for 30-ish years. So it's nice to see it continuing in the RSE group in September. This event is an important part of all that. So best of luck.
Super. Yeah, thanks so much for coming along. And if you're interested, we have our group email address at the bottom of this doc if you want to like catch up. I just know you talked about funding and interest in open source, so it might be nice to maybe catch up at some point.
Yeah, sounds good. Cheers.
Cool. Thank you so much. And then we were 6, including the Invisible Society RSE account. Folks, we have half an hour left. I was going to structure this around building more supportive community. Does that, I guess we kind of strayed into that anyway. So I just wonder if there's any more questions around community or thoughts leading on from what we've been discussing that we wanted to ask. And I am still keeping an eye on the chat as well, Beth, if you want to throw anything in the chat.
Sorry. So one thing that I guess I'm wondering is supportive culture or support from within the project and grown through the project. But I guess there's also support that comes from other sources that is not necessarily directed at any one particular project. I'm thinking now about women in data science, Our Ladies. There are communities that are mainly focusing on improving skills that are transferable with respect to coding rather than being the project community as such. And I guess I'm wondering how much one should or would engage into these alternative efforts of providing a supportive culture.
Beth or Electra, have either of you participated in groups like this?
I come from the hard side of science where we don't share things so much. So, I mean, we share because there's huge collaborations. Like if your collaboration is 3,000 people, you're already sharing with 3,000 people. There's no reason to open to the outside world. So I'm trying to understand how it works.
Cool, yeah. Beth, if you've participated in any that you'd like to share, or maybe you haven't, because there is a reason not to approach, please do just let us know in chat. Talia, I notice you've taken on the mantle of notes. Thank you so much. So our community via Twitter, and do you find that's useful, Beth? Do you find like they give you the like ideas or support that drives you in a useful way? Right, so just for the recording, I'm reading this out. So it's a little ad hoc. And Beth says, my background is as a researcher using code, so I always feel a little outside or behind of proper software engineers. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I came personally from the exact other side. So I came from software engineering and ended up working at a university. So I was a bit afraid of the scientists who knew all the crazy science stuff and all the biology that they were doing. And yeah, it is a bit scary when you sort of feel like, actually, I'm probably doing something wrong, and if I might get spotted at any point as like being an absolute noob. A couple of initiatives that I thought to highlight, and Electra, if you work with David, then I'm guessing you've probably heard of them at the very least. So one is the Google Summer of Code. There we go. I can see the nod. So this is something that helps build community, and it helps get students into coding. So it's not for everyone. But I really like Google Summer of Code just because basically the idea is it used to be 3-month paid internships for someone to work on your open source code, which can also be scientific code if it's open source. And that in my experience works really well as both fixing your docs and stuff, because whilst people are trying to learn, they're going to be spotting places where there's flaws in your documentation. And then once they actually join, if they work as an intern, then they'll also do a lot of work actually on your code base. So again, it's bringing in a new contributor and a new community member. And I think a previous job of mine, I think the last 4 hires that they've had in a very small research group, so basically like more than half the research group these days, actually is composed of interns who've then joined later on. There's a sort of sneaky try before you buy, because it's a short-term commitment of a few weeks or months to see if you work well together, and then actually you share the vacancies with your interns later on when you have vacancies. So I found that is a really nice way of onboarding. But Google Summer of Code really only works for students because you have to be a student to apply. But another one that's coming up really soon. Has anyone here heard of Hacktoberfest? Electra, would you be willing to describe this one for us?
Well, I mean, it's for the month of October, when you contribute, the requirements of contribution have changed over the years, because people would just contribute erroneous changes just to get the t-shirt at the end of the month. So it's all about the t-shirt. Well, the idea is to contribute to an open source project and to bring new people in. So now projects have to define good first issues for newcomers. So I guess it's a good entryway for people that are interested, for really new people, just the process of contributing. It might be a project you care about to contribute, or just anything, just to see the process. I think it's a good entry point. But all those things are like for kind of new people and external to the community that each project is targeting. It's probably more difficult, and fresh people will join happily. Things easier than like an old grumpy researcher. How do you get them to contribute instead of like keeping something in their hard drive, like contribute to the project instead? That might be a whole different demographic and a whole different culture.
Super true. I think it's always easier to grow newbies than it is to convince people who have a way that they like to do. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about ways that you might incentivize people who are already comfortable with what they do.
I guess there is the option of showing how many other people there are falling in the same demographic that do the thing you want them to do. But I guess I wouldn't be sure how to generate such a thing. So because I'm not rarely, so my role works out that I'm contributing to research projects across different domains, and I'm not familiar with the software that's available in the domain. So I find it really hard to say, well, but every other university in the UK is publishing the code or the data, just because I don't know. I wouldn't even know what to look for that.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Software Sustainability Institute, Annika? Yeah, that's probably the best place I would go for resources like that, but I don't know it necessarily always has the answers that you're looking for.
Okay, I will have a look. I have heard, but more in the context of guidelines and trying to get researchers researchers integrated into software development and FAIR. Is that yeah?
Yeah, that's a good choice. So I know the SSI has done some surveys, like, you know, that 7 out of 10 researchers say that they use software on a day-to-day basis and couldn't work without it. There's probably other ones, like if you look through the blog as well. Yeah, that's a good comment, Beth. That some journals may require code sharing as a requirement of submission. I don't know of all that many that do. A lot of them will require data sharing. A few do require it, like GigaScience is one particularly good example. And then there's the Journal of Open Source Software as well, where the is literally just code review rather than scientific review of the paper, which can be quite cool, especially if you're spending most of your time writing code rather than writing papers. I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts or comments on that. Electra, hoping to get the t-shirt. You know that GitLab accounts this year for Hacktoberfest. So if you make a commit and they're actively participating on GitLab, you will build up your t-shirt cred for that.
Good to know.
The other cool thing about Hacktoberfest this year is that they are rewarding maintainers and not just contributors. And that was the reason I didn't get a t-shirt for the first 2 years, is because I was merging pull requests and merging new contributions, and I wasn't making new contributions to other people's repos. So yeah, I too hope that I'm going to get a t-shirt this year. Beth, are there any particular journals that you've noticed that have good code sharing policies? Or any thoughts on code sharing policies in general? Ooh, that's not one I've heard of. That's pretty cool. So Ecology, Methods in Eco and Evolution was the journal name. I've just realized I should say that out loud since we're being recorded, but the recording doesn't capture the chat. And that they ran a workshop at the British Ecological Society and to decide on policies for it. That's really cool. I actually hadn't heard of that. I'm really pleased to learn more about that. Talia, I'm going to randomly pick on you and ask if you have any questions or thoughts that have been raised by our conversation so far, since I have sneakily stolen most of the hosting from you and I'm feeling a bit guilty.
No worries about that. I never knew how big of a role t-shirts played in attracting a community towards open research. That has been enlightening. I guess on that topic, just from the conversation that we've had so far, it seems like there's kind of the push and the pull strategy, whereas the pull might be kind of having things like Summer of Code and lots of opportunities for newcomers, having t-shirts as kind of a reward for engaging in the open source community. Push might be more towards kind of journal requirements. I was just wondering if any of you had reflections on either of those two strategies, or maybe some new suggestions on what journals, potentially funders, might be able to do kind of in that space to help encourage open source or open source work. Or t-shirt design ideas.
Well, I mean, it's great that funders are moving towards the direction of requiring more openness, but they should also fund it.
Mm.
And in the beginning, Yo said that she couldn't contribute to such a project until she started getting paid for it as part of your job. And I have exactly the same problem. I'm not going to start spending my evenings coding in random projects because, as a matter of principle, first of all, and second, just I'm not at that point in my life that I can do this. So on one side, yes, requiring and supporting submitting open code and data with the publication or as a prerequisite to get the funding works great, but enough funding should come to support these activities that would support the communities to create those open software.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think following on from that, it's not just the salary that's creating costs. Nowadays, depending on what you do, you need data storage, infrastructure, compute infrastructure, and it's almost like there is no end to the costs over time. And if you don't get any money in, it's hard to get the people to do the code because then you can't run the software, then you can't see the outputs. And so, yeah, I'm entirely agreeing with Electra that there should be funding for it.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and I think that's a challenge for me and Yo to work on. Probably, I don't know if you had any insight or reflection, Yo, you wanted to share from a funder perspective on some of the things that we've been talking about.
Mostly just to agree. I think that you're right. It is super important that funders make it clear that software is an eligible cost. And even like if we're saying be open or have a community that we support community managers, or if we care about UX, then we want to see UX people in the grant proposals. And I think it's something that we need to change within funding, not only at Wellcome, but more broadly, it's something that we need to make sure that everyone understands it's important. And also, I think another one that's really important to me is maintenance, right? Because software will not run properly if you just leave it alone and come back in 10 years' time. You will not be able to download half of the dependencies. And if it needs to be used longer term, it needs to be maintained. It's not like data where you can continue using it after you've deposited it. It has moving parts.
I guess that goes also that software doesn't stop existing after funding cycle, right? It doesn't live just for 3 years or 2 years or however long you got money for it.
Yeah, it's an interesting dependency, right? Because you cannot continue using software after the grant funding if it's not open, but you also can't support it staying open and maintained without funding. And so it's like, I don't know where the chicken and the egg comes from here. Beth, do you have any particular experiences or thoughts around funding carrots and sticks? I will give Beth a minute to type up any answers if there are any. No pressure if you don't want to answer at this point, Beth. I know it's just a bit harder to insert yourself into conversation when everyone's talking very busily. I wonder if we should do the wrap bit, Talia, if you want to walk us through that. That's not hip hop, that's wrapping up.
Yeah, I'm not gonna start rapping at you. Don't worry, don't leave. I won't scar you like that. I wouldn't make anyone sit through. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of we can wrap up by first of all thanking you all for taking the time. I think that ended up being a really interesting conversation. I personally am always so interested at how I think we structure these initially to kind of talk about the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of making a project open source. And then inevitably it always kind of comes back to culture and people and building community. So I think that we ended up at a really great place. Just like to say again, if you'd like to kind of help us turn these notes into an article, or if you're interested in kind of the things that we've been talking about, these are all themes that we're going to try and pull out on our blog, osscience.org. So if you'd be interested in working on this one piece with us or with us further down the line, then yeah, please do shoot us over an email. We were going to have a form, but that would have made a whole lot of GDPR considerations. So we've just included our email at the bottom of this document. It's o.science@wellcome.org. So yeah, please do reach out if you're at all interested in working with us. And yeah, it's been great to chat. Yo, did you have any further ending comments or reflection, wise tidbits?
One thought actually. Yeah, so like Talia mentioned, drop us a line if this is something that interests you that you'd like to explore further. But also maybe just addressing briefly Electra's comment about the funding. Is that if we for this blog we are looking for paid editors to do stints for short periods of time. So that we aren't asking for free labor unless that's what works best for you. But instead, if you are interested in saying, maybe it's even, I'm an open source skeptic, but I want to tell my story, or maybe it's I'm an open source newbie and I want to talk about some of the barriers I've faced. I think those would all be very interesting feature articles for our blog. So if any of those appeal to you and you want to continue the conversation, then our email address is at the very bottom of the doc.
Thanks for that, Yo. All right, well, if I guess that kind of sums up this workshop. Again, thanks so much for joining. Yeah, thanks so much. People can feel free to kind of drop off, I guess, or if anyone has any specific questions and wants to hang around, me and Yo will be here for the next 9 minutes. But yeah, it was great to meet all of you, and thank you so much for contributing.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.